Hello and welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. I'm Julie Laffer, the Executive Director for Alumni Engagement here at York. Thanks for joining us today. I want to send a special welcome to the Chiefs and Council members in attendance today. This webinar is part of our Scholars Hub speaker series, which features educational lectures by academics and researchers from York. We're pleased to be able to bring this series online to allow even more alumni and friends to hear from some of the university's leading scholars. The lecture will also be available on YouTube, our YouTube channel, so you can share it with friends and family. Before we begin, I want to share some exciting news. Last month, a groundbreaking event marked the beginning of construction on York University's Markham Center campus. The $275.5 million, 10-story state-of-the-art campus is expected to open in fall 2023 and welcome 4,200 students. For other university stories and updates, look for the October issue of our monthly e-newsletter, Alumni Matters, which would have landed in your inboxes yesterday. Although we aren't all in the same location, we recognize many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. As this meeting is virtual, and we're not all gathered in the same space, I recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory you're currently on. We ask, if this is the case, that you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on, as well as the current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which our campuses are located. We acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and this territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Before beginning today's lecture, we always like to get to know our audience, so there'll be a poll appearing on your screen soon asking, how would you rate your understanding of today's topic? This is very helpful to us and to our lecturer in determining who's out there in the audience and how much knowledge you have about the topic. Thanks for taking the time to participate in that poll. If you need any help with the Zoom webinar, feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question. And I have the results of the poll now, and we have 10% of the audience, which is great, has very high knowledge of the topic, and with 45% somewhat informed and 40% minimal. So I'm sure we all have lots to learn today, and I'm also sure that the discussion at the end will be fantastic. So as I was saying about the Zoom webinar, that Q&A button below, we can either give you technical help, or you can use that same button to submit any questions you have for our lecturer today. And I'll do my best to get to as many questions as possible when I moderate the Q&A later on. For those of you watching live on Facebook, you can submit questions in Facebook through the comments section there, and the team in the background will get those questions over to me. So now on to today's talk. The title is Indigenous Nationhood in the Age of COVID-19, Reflection on the Evolution of Sovereignty in Settler-Colonial States. Our lecturer today is Sean Hillier, Assistant Professor in the School of Health Policy and Management and Special Advisor to the Dean of Health on Indigenous Resurgence. Dr. Sean Hillier is a queer Mi'kmaq scholar from the Haliput First Nation. He is the co-chair of the Indigenous Council at York and is a board member of the AIDS Committee of Toronto. His research focuses on how policy shapes and impacts access to and utilization of healthcare for Indigenous peoples in Canada. He continues to work in the area of HIV research and is an investigator with the Canadian Institutes of Health Research HIV Trials Network. Welcome, Dr. Hillier. It's a pleasure having you join us today. I'm so looking forward to this lecture.
Thank you so much, Julie. And hello to everybody. So I'd like to welcome you all to my lecture today on Indigenous Nationhood in the Age of COVID-19, Reflection on the Evolution of Sovereignty in Settler-Colonial States. This presentation is the culmination of research that I've been doing with my team, looking at how pandemics are impacting Indigenous peoples, but more specifically, how Indigenous peoples have taken the opportunity presented during these trying times to re-exert their own nationhood and sovereignty. And so we saw significant issues during H1N1 here in Canada in the government's response to the pandemic. And so I wanted to really look at how has COVID been impacting communities and how have communities been resisting or pushing back against settler colonial states. And so for the presentation today, we're going to look at the context of pandemics in Canada and the impact it's had on Indigenous people. We're going to talk about the processes of Native nationhood, which is the framework by Cornell in 2015 that this presentation is based upon. And so we're going to look at how COVID-19 has been impacting the three aspects of nationhood. So identifying as a nation or a people, organizing as a political body, and acting as a nation on behalf of Indigenous goals. And then I'll leave you with some concluding thoughts at the end. So I'd like to start this presentation with some acknowledgements, and I'd like to thank Julie for acknowledging the territories that we're on. But I want to give special thanks to two of my students, Elias and Hamza, who've been instrumental in collecting the data that I'm presenting to you today. Also very grateful for the support of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. A COVID-specific grant has helped fund this, as well as the One Health Network for the Global Governance of Infectious Disease and Antimicrobial Resistance. There are no conflicts of interest to declare, and that this presentation is an adaptation from a manuscript that's been accepted to the Journal of Indigenous Social Development. So to start, I want to provide you with some context as to what's been happening in this specific area. And so for those of you that are unaware of the conceptualization of colonialism, this is the process by which a political power exerts its control over another foreign territory. It has strong roots in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. So going forward, these will be referred to as CANZ-US in short form. And so this is important to understand that in contemporary settings, Indigenous communities identify themselves as sovereign nations. However, within the colonial constructs of the nations of Canada, of Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, those nations don't recognize Indigenous communities, as they call them, as sovereign nations. And so this is what we're going to be examining and looking at today. So COVID-19 has been harming Indigenous communities at disproportionate rates. And this is very true when we specifically look at Australia and the United States, but also in Canada and New Zealand, especially amongst urban Indigenous populations. And I want to throw one thing out there. I'm going to talk a lot about funding and the impact of funding, but I want to provide context to that. And note that less than 1% of all COVID funding in Canada has actually gone to Indigenous communities for response to COVID-19. And so it's important to have that in the back of your mind as we talk about some fairly large sums of money, to place that in the context to the billions and billions of dollars currently being spent around the pandemic and its response. So to provide you with some historical context around pandemics and Indigenous peoples, pandemics have historically caused the eradication of Indigenous peoples, and they remain a threat to our existence and well-being. We know that early European settlers brought diseases to which Indigenous people had no natural immunity, including smallpox, the 1918 Spanish flu, tuberculosis, known as TB, influenza, and measles. And the reason you see TB, influenza, and measles still highlighted in bold here is because these are still very much present in Indigenous communities today. We like to specifically think of TB as being something that we see in the developing world. However, we have extremely high rates of TB across the North, substantially impacting Indigenous communities. And so when we think about modern pandemics and the impact on Indigenous peoples, we know that more recent infectious diseases have disproportionately impacted Indigenous communities, and that this has left populations devastated and significantly reduced in their numbers. And this includes H1N1. And so I would note that the previous response to H1N1 by the Canadian government, so H1N1 we saw in 2009 to 10, when Manitoba First Nations communities asked for assistance in in the picture you see to the right, what the federal government sent to these First Nations communities were post-mortem kits. And they actually sent more post-mortem kits to Indigenous communities than they actually sent preparation flu kits to them. We also saw SARS have a disproportional impact on Indigenous communities, and today hepatitis C and HIV are taking a devastating toll on Indigenous populations, especially Indigenous women. And so aside from Indigenous people's lack of immunity to foreign diseases, the community spread of post-contact diseases is also influenced by the social and political circumstances that have been established through colonization. And this includes the reservation system across North America and in Australia, where we see a lack of clean drinking water, a lack of housing, overcrowding in housing, a lack of access to medical care, all of which exacerbate communicable and infectious diseases amongst this very specific population. And so what I'm going to be kind of premising this discussion on today is a paper written by Cornell in 2015 called Processes of Native Nationhood, the Indigenous Politics of Self-Government. And so through this, Cornell talks about three very explicit aspects of exerting nationhood and sovereignty that are required to be followed by Indigenous peoples in actually showing the exertion of nationhood. And so these are the three identifying aspects that he discusses. And so these will form the basis of the analysis of the policy of media scans that we have completed. And the first is identifying as a nation or a people, which involves various degrees of the imposition of boundaries, which separate the us from the rest of the social system, and the readoption of traditions and identity, and organizations such as identifying with pre-colonial social identities and structures, and the assertion of self-governing powers. Second is to organize as a political body with a decision-making process that allows for the ability to implement decisions, resolve disputes, and to sustain productive relationships with other governments and entities. And the third is acting on behalf of Indigenous goals by defending the rights of self-government, not only through moral and legal arguments, but also through deeds, advocacy, and competence. And so to give you a little context, we used this framework. The reason we went to the Cornell framework is that it captures very nicely this idea of nationhood, not just within one settler colonial country, but this framework is used as a way to digest this across all four of the settler colonial states that we're examining. And so what we did is that we compiled data through a comprehensive search of both policy announcements and media related to COVID-19 and Indigenous people. So the first thing that we did is we did a comprehensive search of Indigenous specific COVID-19 related policies that were announced by the various governments between December and June across all four of the countries identified. So Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And then second is that we completed a media search using Factivia database. And so this compiles all the media reports that capture COVID-19 and Indigenous peoples. And so as we weeded through duplications and announcements, we took out a total of 140 different results that were included in this work and included in the final manuscript. And that we'll only be making reference to a few of those during this presentation today. So the first that we want to talk about is identifying as a nation or a people. And so when we talk about this, we look at identifying as a nation often involves interaction among at least three sets of influences. And so we're going to break down each of these influences and show how these have been exerted during COVID-19. And the first are imposed boundaries of various kinds. The second is older but still living traditions of identity and organization. And the third is asserting self-governing power in contemporary times. And so the first aspect of identifying as a nation or a people is the imposition of boundaries. So Indigenous communities have strongly asserted sovereignty and independent decision-making as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. National and regional governments have generally acknowledged that Indigenous communities have the right to control their borders and are entitled to national funding to support their efforts to combat this disease. In Canada, the Haida Tribal Council passed a resolution that restricted access to First Nation lands to Indigenous residents and essential service providers until provisions, which included prioritized testing for residents of remote and Indigenous communities, the screening of non-residents, and contact tracing and communication protocols were put into place. Additionally, following calls from many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders and remote communities, the Australian government restricted travel into remote communities under the Biosecurity Act of 2015. And finally, non-Native Americans have been banned from using roads on reservations that have created checkpoints and mobile health units, all in an attempt to keep residents of tribal lands safe. And so we've seen this imposition of boundaries by Indigenous communities and Indigenous nations in these 4 settler-colonial countries as a way to exert sovereignty and independence and to protect their people during the COVID pandemic. The second aspect of identifying as a nation or people is exerting self-governing power in contemporary times. Indigenous leaders are in a situation to further assert their right to self-governance in the face of colonial structures and laws. In Canada, we see that Chief Bobby Cameron of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations in the province of Saskatchewan declared that government public health orders do not supersede First Nations law and treaties. And in response to this, we saw the federal minister come out and say that First Nations laws and treaty rights had to be abided by, and that communities are working with public health officials in order to create the best way forward for their communities. Additionally, the Australian Northern Territory Police face significant challenges in enforcing social distance measures in Aboriginal communities when dealing with cultural events, and that this situation required them to work collaboratively with communities, with elders, and with Australian Indigenous organizations to overcome these challenges and find a way forward that was beneficial for everybody involved. And third, we see identifying as a nation and people as the traditions of identity and organization. Indigenous communities have sought to express their cultural independence while dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. A Cree Nation's chief and council put in place regulations that allow the continuation of a Sundance ceremony. This sacred ceremony was broken up by armed Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers who were dispatched to the ceremony to investigate violations of public health orders. But Chief and Council pushed back against this and said that our sovereign rights as a nation are to be protected in that we are putting in policies and protocols that follow the best scientific advice to ensure our people are safe. We also see that communities across North America have found a way to host traditional ceremonies and powwows by moving them online. Additionally, Indigenous communities are thriving in lockdown communities across Northern Australia, a result of families connecting and partaking in cultural teachings with their children. So it's been very important that through the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen the exertion of traditional ceremony and traditional healing practices that have come out to work not in opposition to, but in collaboration with Western modes of healing and best practices. So the second is organizing as a political body. So organizing as a political body, it is one thing to identify as a nation and another to acquire the organizational capacity that is sufficient to formulate and implement collective decisions consistently and effectively. And so what's important to highlight here is that although Indigenous communities in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States identify as nations within nations, they generally lack the infrastructure, resources, and technical capabilities to actually implement collective decisions when it comes to responding to the complex issues that are medical and social effects as a result of COVID-19. And it has to be noted that this isn't as a result that this general lack of infrastructure, resources, and technical capabilities is not as a result of the downfall of Indigenous communities, but as a result of colonial processes that have taken those abilities away from Indigenous communities themselves. So there are three aspects to this as well. So when organizing as a political body, the first thematic aspect that we looked at was the deferral to Indigenous leadership regarding the utilization of national government funding. National governments have imposed minimal restrictions on their funding for Indigenous communities and services during COVID-19. Governments have generally deferred to Indigenous leadership when it comes to funding utilization, thereby allowing communities to define their own infrastructure and service needs. In Canada, the federal government has been flexible in terms of funding allocation and policy decisions for Indigenous communities. The federal government has provided an investment of more than $650 million to support Indigenous communities with healthcare, income support, and new shelters for women. And much of this money has been given unrestricted in the sense that it isn't allocated as we typically see by the feds. The Australian government made $123 million available over 2 fiscal years for targeted measures to support Indigenous businesses and communities in response to COVID-19, and that they're allowing this to be administered through Indigenous community organizations. And in the United States, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, signed on March 27, 2020, provides additional funding to assist tribes in preventing, preparing for, and responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. The second way we see communities organizing as a political body is through government support to increase the capacity of Indigenous communities to implement public health measures effectively. So in addition to direct funding support that I just discussed, governments have provided direct medical, technical, and resource support for communities to assist them in effectively implementing public health programming. The Canadian government has been delivering large amounts of protective equipment to Indigenous communities to ensure that they can protect their citizens and frontline workers against the pandemic. Additionally, the Australian government invested more than $3.3 million to establish the rapid COVID-19 remote point-of-care testing program with 83 testing sites for remote and rural Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And in the United States, a $750 million fund was provided for Indigenous communities in coordination with the Indian Health Service to help tribal nations develop, purchase, administer, process, and analyze COVID-19 tests, to scale up laboratory capacity within their communities, and to trace the spread of the disease. Again, this is meant to be community-based, driven, and localized responses to the pandemic that best meet the needs of that local community. And the third aspect of this is, as organizing as a political body, is the ability to sustain productive relationships with other governments and organizations. Implementing effective public health responses requires close and trustworthy coordination between governments and Indigenous leadership. Funding allocation and distribution entails the input of Indigenous communities to determine their own needs. And that nation-to-nation coordination allows for better planning and for preparedness to address the unique situation and the needs of Indigenous peoples. National Indigenous leaders in Canada have been liaising with the Prime Minister and the federal ministers on the COVID-19 pandemic. This nation-to-nation coordination allows for better planning and preparedness to actually address the unique situations and the unique needs of Indigenous peoples. Additionally, the National Indigenous Australian Agency has been actively working across government and with industry stakeholders in order to ensure that remote community stores and food security are part of the government's response to COVID-19. So overall, what we have seen are communities embracing this idea of organizing as a political body, either as individual nations or as a collective group of nations or as national collective groups of nations to pressure governments, whether regional, provincial, or national, to actually implement responses to the pandemic for Indigenous peoples. The third aspect of this framework is acting as a nation on behalf of Indigenous goals. And so what we see are that Indigenous communities are exercising practical decision-making power and responsibility, even in cases where central governments are denying them that recognition. And so in Canada, we see that the Assembly of First Nations Executive Committee has passed a resolution motion on March 23rd, declaring a state of emergency respecting First Nations in the COVID-19 pandemic. The Torres Strait Regional Authority in Australia offered a COVID-19 related community initiatives grant for community organizations to sustain their operations that are essential to the community or to provide additional supports during and after the pandemic. And in the United States, the Center for American Indian Health has mobilized over 200 Native American health workers to assist their communities. And the center has also distributed food, water, and personal protective equipment and information on COVID-19 that is applicable to their people specifically. And so overall, we see Indigenous nations or communities acting as nations on behalf of the goals that they've set for themselves throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. So what are some of my concluding thoughts? So what are the COVID-19 implications for Indigenous peoples? The pandemic has presented Indigenous communities with increased urgency and agency in reasserting the cultural, political, and social aspects of their nationhood. Currently, the healthcare system imposed on Indigenous peoples within Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States is defective in two very critical ways. One is that Indigenous healing practices significantly differ from mainstream healthcare practices, with the latter greatly more available to Indigenous communities. And so it's been important for Indigenous communities to say, stop, we are going to direct what's important for our communities in terms of healthcare. And that means that we're going to do this in a way through ceremony and through traditional healing practices, in addition to Western ways of knowing and being and Western medical care. The second is that there's a lack of equitable interventions and services in communities that rely on understaffed healthcare posts. And this is typically a result of jurisdictional disorganization with regard to funding and delegating responsibilities. And so it's been important for Indigenous nations and communities to say, no, we want to stipulate what's going to happen with this, and that we need to be able to get this funding and to dictate how it's going to be used for the best, in the best interests of our people and our communities. So very quickly, some points of interest. The results show very specific trends in the process of Indigenous assertion of nationhood during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, these trends are situated at a very high level, and they're influenced by the historical, social, and political circumstances of the states in which the respective Indigenous communities reside. And so we see in Canada, it's progressed more quickly than we see in Australia, and it's been different than how we see it in the United States, even at a national level, but even at a provincial or state level, it's very different. And that overall, you would have saw a lack of results on the New Zealand Indigenous experience through this presentation. And this is an indication of the existence of models of Indigenous nationhood that do not fit into Cornell's framework. And so we see that New Zealand has a very different framework for how they engage in this type of work. And so it was very difficult to fit that into this model. And so why does this matter? The Canadian experience with COVID-19 showcases a trend that has been developing over time of relinquishing state control over Indigenous matters to Indigenous nations themselves. While the United States federal government regularly distributes funding to communities and regional health efforts, we have seen an increase in agency and autonomy given to Indigenous groups in utilizing these funds. In comparison, Australian Indigenous nationhood continues to reflect the extreme cultural, historical, and colonial experiences of Indigenous Australians. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues to evolve, we expect further development of the settler-colonial assertion of Indigenous public health and nationhood. And so why should you care? We observed a need for national and regional governments to provide funding and technical resources necessary to counter the pandemic. The assertion of nationhood during the developing pandemic requires tools and resources to engage in an effective public health response. We observed within all examined states the need for national and regional governments to assist in providing funding and technical resources. And so this is the result of colonial and racist policy frameworks that have made Indigenous communities reliant on financial assistance from government for centuries, nothing of their own making or choice. And I think that this is important to highlight, that this need to rely on national and regional governments is not the choice of Indigenous communities, but one of a long history of racist colonial policy. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, Indigenous communities have been able to exert practical decision-making power and responsibility. And what I really want you to take away from this is that this helps to change the narratives or the tropes that Indigenous peoples have been a conquered people. Indigenous peoples were never conquered, especially in Canada. Our treaties continue to exist, and the Supreme Court has said we have not been conquered, and that we continue to exert this nation-to-nation relationship, and that it's important for us to carry that on. Thank you.
Sean, thank you so much for the lecture. It was fantastic, very informative. And it's really interesting to me to see how the pandemic has actually allowed for opportunities for Indigenous peoples to assert nationhood, especially in Canada. So now I'm going to turn things over to the audience to ask any questions they may have for Dr. Hillier. So if you're watching on Zoom, a reminder to please enter questions in that Q&A function, and on Facebook to submit your questions in the comment box. So I think I have my first question now. Oh, this is an interesting one. Why was South Africa not included in this study?
Yeah, so we were really looking at kind of the four major current settler colonial states. So where there's still a strong imposition of colonial processes and sovereign Indigenous nations that are looked at. And so when we talk about this typically, and when we were looking at frameworks, what we found was that Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand are typically what were kind of covered within that framework. And so we had to find a way to limit this, because we could have included a number of other countries through this, but it was really in consultation of kind of the scope of what we could take on, and as well as the relation to the framework that would have been provided. That's a great question.
Yeah, thank you. So your presentation discussed nationhood and sovereignty issues at play during the pandemic. And we'd like to hear more about how Indigenous peoples are otherwise coping or being impacted by COVID-19.
That's a great question. So Indigenous people have been coping in different ways in relation to this. As I noted, that we're seeing, stark contrast between how the pandemic is unfolding in the United States and on Australia and the impact that it's having on Indigenous communities there than what we see in Canada and New Zealand. And so Canada and New Zealand, I would say, are much further ahead in terms of how they're engaging in the response to allowing kind of this self-determination and this directing of how resources are going to be used in communities, as opposed to the United States, where we see significant turmoil overall in terms of testing, the availability of testing, of funding. We're seeing huge spikes where, we're seeing in the southern US, in some tribes where we have the highest per capita COVID positivity rates in the entire country. And so this is the complexity of the matter, is that each nation state has taken it in a very different direction. And certainly we see significant concern with remote communities specifically, because if COVID were to get into remote communities, the ability for it to spread is quite high due to issues of a lack of clean drinking water, a lack of sanitation, a lack of infrastructure, crowded housing, a lack of housing. All those types of things exacerbate the spread of communicable diseases. And so those are kind of where we see Indigenous people at the highest rates of lack of clean drinking water, housing, all those types of things. And so this is why we continue to mount this as a concern.
Right. Thank you for that. So my next question is actually my own question. I often sneak in my own because I can. You mentioned right off the top that less than 1% of COVID funding in Canada has gone to Indigenous communities. And now I'm aware that Indigenous communities make up about 1% of Canada's population, but considering the fact that Indigenous peoples have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, what's the right number?
Yeah, so I would actually note that the Indigenous population in Canada is 4.8% of the Canadian population.
Wow. Okay.
5%. So at a start, we're saying 1%. Yeah, 1% is drastically lower than even kind of if we were looking at a percentage basis is drastically underfunded. But what I would say is even more dire here is the fact that healthcare access is extremely expensive to deliver to Indigenous communities, because we're talking about providing access in the far north in really remote rural communities. And so by that very nature, it's going to be more expensive to deliver care, and it's going to be more expensive to deliver supplies and PPE and testing and all those types of things. And so when we see such a low number being provided to communities, like, how do we just rapidly put PPE and essential supplies, but equally these communities don't have infrastructure to treat and to take up those. So some may have rural nursing stations and those types of things, but they're not going to be effective in responding to a communicable infectious disease like COVID-19. And so that 1% really is a very minor amount of money in terms of not only trying to sustain the healthcare aspects, but also the economic aspects that are devastating Indigenous communities as well.
Thank you, and thank you for correcting me. I've learned a lot today, and that's one I won't forget. So I see we have another question from the audience. So Edmund asks, if there is an opportunity for absolute nationhood, which includes renegotiated borders, own passport, own military, recognition by UN economic systems, would Indigenous people embrace this opportunity?
That's a very interesting question. So thank you for that. I think there's a lot of discussion amongst Indigenous peoples themselves as to what nationhood means and represents. And I think there are extremes. Certainly, I think there are people that say, oh, nationhood can only be achieved when we have when we're recognized by the United Nations and other international bodies to say that we're a sovereign nation, that we establish clear borders and we have our own laws and we have our own passports. But I think for most individuals, and so I'm just one Indigenous person, I can't speak on behalf of all Indigenous people, it's about recognition. It's about saying, no, this is a nation-to-nation collaboration, that we can exist within the nation state of Canada, but we are recognized as sovereign nations, that we get to decide what laws apply within the context of our borders, but that we don't need our own military, that we don't need all of these kind of different things, that we can work in collaboration, but that this very archaic colonial process needs to stop, that we need to be able to better our people in some way. And I don't think, the redefining of, 350 sovereign nations within Canada is going to ever be the solution. I don't think we'll ever achieve that. And so what's a more achievable way to push this forward?
Thank you. Next question is, why is it important to be discussing the furthering of Indigenous sovereignty at this time?
Yeah, I think it's very important. I think that so people will always ask this, like, Sean, we should be focused on the pandemic. Why are we talking about nationhood and sovereignty? And it's because if we don't consistently talk about nationhood and sovereignty, it gets taken away. So if we don't take up the space to say, oh, look, we're not just imposing boundaries, but we're doing this in a very critical, very constructed manner that says, oh, we are a sovereign people, that we adhere to our treaties, that Canada must respect our treaties, that the United States must respect the treaties, that Australia must respect treaties and agreements. If we don't continuously say that and show examples of it, then it's easy for people to walk it away. And until we really place it in the domain of the public, because again, when I talk about tropes that are out there, most people think that Indigenous people have been conquered. Why are we still giving Indigenous people anything? Why aren't they just a part of society? Why don't they just assimilate? So if we don't continuously push back to those tropes, then those continue to be the tropes. And so I think it's really important. And we have a really critical time. Indigenous people are coming out, and we're seeing lots of media attention being brought to the issue of infectious disease within Indigenous communities. And I think now is a really great time to say, oh, the government is deferring to us, and this is the way it should be, not just for COVID, but it should be like this all of the time. And it allows us to further the argument to the government, to the people of Canada, and hopefully to the courts, to say, when the government comes back a year from now when COVID may be over and says, oh, well, no, we're going to start doing this again, we're going to say, well, no, we were able to do this effectively during a world pandemic, a national emergency. So we should be able to do this all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent, excellent points. So I'm going to make one last call to the audience for questions. We have a few minutes left, so I can squeeze in a couple more. Oh, and here's one. Oh my goodness, it's like I ask for it and they pop up. So Kareem has a question, Kareem Bonner. Great presentation, and I learned a lot today. My question is, how come in Canada we've been really bad at addressing and respecting the needs of Indigenous groups, and that in 2020 we haven't effectively addressed colonialism and racial inequalities? Woo! Over to you, Dr. Hillier, for that one.
Yeah, so I specialize very specifically in HIV and infectious disease, and so people always come back to me when I finish my PhD. And so they were like, "How do we eradicate HIV in Indigenous communities?" And I said, "Well, until you address the underlying systemic societal issues that have led Indigenous people to being the poorest people in Canada, to living in the worst housing conditions, all these different types of things, the legacy of residential schooling of the 60s scoop, and continue today with the highest rates of incarceration in Canada are Indigenous people. The highest rates of child welfare in Canada are for Indigenous children. The over-policing of Indigenous people, that we still in Canada live under a colonial system. So the Indian Act continues to relegate and delegate every aspect of Indigenous life for Indigenous people in Canada still. So when people ask me, it's like, oh, I have a status card that says I'm a 6A Indian, right? And people will ask, well, why is it 6A? And it's because you can pull up the Indian Act, and Section 6, subsection A of the Indian Act says this is what this Indian is and what they're entitled to from the Canadian government. And so while we continue to live under a system of this nature, and we have colonial policies that dictate every aspect of the life and being of even our nation. So when we talk about our nation-to-nation discussion, that nation-to-nation discussion is an imposed nation. So we did not construct our reserve system. Our chief and councils are a construction of Western ideas of governance, of all those types of things. Our matriarchal systems have been thrown out the door. All of our traditional governance systems have been thrown out the door for an imposed system that we see today, that we now use, and that we've been reclaiming those ever so slowly, and lots of communities are doing that work. But it takes a lot of time and effort and collaboration and resources. And so Indigenous people have been suppressed from education, have been suppressed from society for generations. And so we're slowly starting to have Indigenous people work their way through that process, through that educational process, to better themselves, but to come back and better their communities. And that's why it's so important that we ensure Indigenous people are succeeding at all levels of education and really putting that emphasis there, because we can't break down these systems until we have our people there fighting for us. And we need people like you who are allies to question, why does the system still exist, and why is it that we are still dealing with these issues in 2020?
Thank you, Dr. Hillier. That was a really great response to what was, for me, a really huge and intimidating question, which is why you're the lecturer and I'm just the moderator. I think we're going to leave things off at there. I think it's a good place to leave things off. And I just want to thank you again so much for being with us today, for taking the time to share your knowledge with us, and a personal thank you for all that I have learned today as well.
Miigwech, thank you all.
Thank you. Before we say goodbye to you in the audience, I want to thank you all again for taking your time to join us. I also wanted to mention York's Indigenous Alumni Network, which was established about a year ago. And the Indigenous Network exists to support Indigenous students on campus, although they're not on campus this year. So if you're interested in learning more or getting involved, I'd love for you to reach out to us, alumni@yorku.ca. And with that, we have one last poll question for you, which will appear on your screen in a moment. How would you rate your understanding of today's topic following this discussion? And thank you for taking the time to do that. So you can, as I mentioned at the top, you can feel free to share this talk with your friends and family, others who might be interested. It will be posted on our YouTube channel shortly. You can also join our LinkedIn group or follow us on Facebook by searching York University Alumni. And you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter @YorkU Alumni. And if you have feedback about this, any of our other programming, if you have ideas, comments, questions, concerns, feel free to reach out to us, alumni@yorku.ca. Scholars Hub at Home is back next week with Tattoos and Trauma, Why We Commemorate, on Wednesday, October 14th at noon Eastern Time with Dr. Deborah Davidson, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology. And if you want to learn more about our entire fall lineup, visit our website at yorku.ca/alumni and friends and click on events. Thanks again for your time, and I wish you a great Wednesday.